All right. Well, today on the show, we are excited to talk to Jules Woodson. Jules, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Jules, just for anybody out there watching, listening, and maybe they're not familiar with who you are, some of your story, could you just introduce yourself to the audience?
Absolutely. So I am Jules Woodson. When I was 17 years old, I was sexually assaulted by my youth pastor, Andy Savage. I reported the assault within 24 hours to the associate pastor of my church. He interrupted me and blatantly asked, "So you're telling me you participated?" And it was then that I knew that I was being blamed for what had happened to me. They said the church would handle it. The senior pastor was notified immediately. They did nothing for several weeks. Andy Savage went on to teach True Love Waits to my youth group. Um, Nothing had happened. I ended up telling a few more people in my girls' discipleship group, not all the details, but kind of the baseline of what happened. It was one of their parents that then contacted Larry Cotton and Steve Bradley. And that was when the church decided they needed to act to do something. So they allowed Andy to resign. They threw him a going away party. And he went back to Tennessee and within 6 months was working at another church. Um, the church where my abuse happened, it was called Woodlands Parkway Baptist Church, now Stonebridge Church, never once reached out to me to ask me more questions, to see if I was okay, um, to offer any sort of assistance. It was just to not be talked about. And subsequently, I um, went into a deep depression and it greatly affected me. Fast forward 20 years later, and in January of 2018, I decided to go public with my story after I had emailed my abuser and he didn't respond to me personally. I told my story on Dee Parsons' blog, The Wartburg Watch, and genuinely, I thought maybe 100 people would read my story, but if it helped one other survivor who had been through something similar to know that they were not alone, it was worth it to me. And little did I know that my abuser would then come out with a statement admitting to the assault. Of course, he minimized it, called it a sexual incident, mentioned many times how it was 20 years ago, whatnot. 2 days later, he basically read his statement at his church, which was a mega church in Tennessee, High Point Church, and received a standing ovation from the congregation. And it was that really kind of blew my story out of the water and made uh, quite the news circuit because a pastor admitted to sexually assaulting a minor in his care and received a standing ovation. So that's kind of the brief rundown of what I've been through up until the point of going public. I have continued to, since 2018, to continue to speak out and help in any way I can use my voice to not only advocate for myself, but for all survivors who have been abused in the church.
Yeah. Wow. And then even the New York Times featured your
Uh-huh.
story, correct?
They
Yeah.
did. They did. They wrote about my story several times, and then we did a video, an opinion piece that was very powerful.
Yeah. And we'll link to all that in the show notes so people can read that, read your story, watch the video. And one of the things that really jumps out to me is I follow you on Twitter, and
Mhm.
here we are. We're just a few days away from the Southern Baptist Convention in Nashville. You tweeted out a thread on Saturday, I believe it was, with very specific things calling the Southern Baptist Convention to do on behalf of survivors. And that thread just really, I saw it got shared a lot, retweeted a lot. And I messaged you. I said, Jules, I would love to ask you some questions about this. You were really quick to respond. And so thank you for that. But I would love, what has been, and you can even go into some detail that you actually did talk about in the thread. What has been the response of the Southern Baptist Convention since
Yeah,
you shared your story?
well, it's been pretty atrocious, to say the least. There really hasn't been great response.
Mhm.
So just to kind of, give you an idea, um, I've reached out to the executive committee, the credentials committee that they formed. I submitted that Steve Bradley and Stonebridge Church should be disfellowshipped from the Southern Baptist Convention on the grounds that, not only did they not report my assault to police, 20 years ago and made intentional efforts to cover up what had happened, but then when I went public, they made a media statement basically denying that there was any cover up. Um, and to me, it's horrible, horrible, horrible.
Hmm.
I really don't have words that I can probably say on the podcast to
Hmm.
describe what that felt like. And so I've given, the church a chance to do the right thing. And they obviously have chosen not to. I reached out to Steve Bradley personally with a very long, extensive letter asking a lot of questions. And I never got a response. And for the SBC to then say that this church is in faithful cooperation with them is mind blowing.
Hmm.
So ultimately, that's why I submitted to the credentials committee, which I've posted about all of that uh, hoopla. And it's really just been a circus. No one is trained to deal with trauma and abuse. They're not educated.
Hmm.
Of course, they say we're not an investigative team, but they had no problem reaching out to Stonebridge and taking statement from them. Yet they never once reached out to me as the survivor who had put in the submission to have Stonebridge disfellowshipped. It's just it's been a real mess, and nobody seems to know what they're doing. There's secret alliances that we're finding out in leaked letters and audio, and um, just it's a real state of disaster. It's a real state of disaster. And so um, yeah, ultimately I would say they have done nothing, and there are so many leaders that have had the chance to speak out and use their voice to support survivors, and it's pretty much been crickets.
And so just to clarify, the credentials committee, what would be their role in disfellowshipping a church from the Southern Baptist Convention?
So they made it very clear we are not investigators, we're not investigating him, but they basically said, we're looking into whether churches are in friendly cooperation with their statements and whatnot. And
Hmm.
so they weren't, I would say they weren't really given, authority or the setup or the training or the education, the background to really do much. That being said, the bare minimum would be to look at this and say, obviously, this is not how we want a Southern Baptist church to respond to sexual abuse. And to me, it's very black and white. After reading their statement denying a cover up, seeing that they've basically refused to engage with me in any sort of communication. And it's mind-blowing how then the credentials committee could say, thanks for all you've done, but sorry, we're not doing anything to help you. And
Wow.
I
And
have
so,
posted that letter that I got from the credentials committee. I apologize. I have
hey, you're
posted that
good.
letter that I got from the credentials committee uh, online. So it's available, and I believe it's on D. Parsons' blog as well.
Okay. All right. And so the credentials committee, and you already mentioned this, but just to go deeper into it, they have not contacted you.
They did contact me with a letter.
Okay.
Um,
With the letter. Yeah. 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 Okay.
with a letter after they had, made their decision, but never when, in the months and months they had my submission and, we're technically looking into things, and they did, reach out to Stonebridge. So
Wow. Have you, so outside of the letter, when they were looking into it, investigating, whatever, um, have you been contacted by anyone in the Southern Baptist Convention?
I've spoken with a few, pastors who have tried to continue to be supportive, and certainly other survivors, but no, nobody in leadership has reached out to me to
Wow.
say, um, you know, what can we do?
Wow. Hmm. Okay. That's very disheartening. No, not even a reach out to that they just are so sorry for what happened and just to
Yeah,
contact you. Not even that. My
yeah,
goodness.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's been extremely disheartening. I will say I did have one member of the executive committee that I corresponded with um, before the credentials committee made a decision
Mhm.
in, trying to make sure that they were doing the right thing and taking my submission seriously. And but so many times, people have just thrown their hands up and said, nothing I can do, you know.
Hmm. Yeah. And one of the things that, and I have heard this numerous times. You actually addressed this on Twitter in your thread that, oh well, all of these cases, these are just a few bad apples, and
Yes,
but
I have
you
heard that
actually,
so many times.
I can't, yeah, absolutely, and I have too. But you actually said this is not a few bad apples. This is a systemic problem.
It
And
is.
so, could you go into some detail there? What are some examples of what do you mean when you say this is a systemic problem in the SBC?
Sure. So it is obvious that they have created a culture that not only protects abusers, but allows abuse to thrive.
Hmm.
And without any systems in place to protect the vulnerable, they have created a monster, and it truly is systemic. And when I say that, we're looking at things such as, harmful theology when it comes to women
Hmm.
and male headship and patriarchy, and we're looking at harmful theology when we talk about, the purity culture, and and just how the church talks about sex and all that. So there's a lot of ways that the organization and the system itself has, like I said, created and perpetuated what we're now seeing is coming to light, that they've made it a safe place. They've made it a place that has no accountability for when accusations, do come out, and abuse does come to light. Then there's no way to hold them accountable. We're seeing
Hmm.
the power structures at play when it comes to covering up um, these evil deeds, and it's very, very sad and disgusting.
Yeah. One of the things that I have heard people say before, and it might be something, maybe I've heard people say it in response to even what you just to some of the things that you just said is, and I would love to hear you respond to this. When people, um, you know, might say online or in conversation that the SBC hasn't taken enough action for survivors. They haven't taken some real steps for change, and I've heard people say, well, there was the Caring Well conference. They established the sexual abuse advisory study, and so they're doing things are happening. What would you say to that?
I'd say it's been a lot of lip service and a lot of
Hmm.
PR promotion on their part. But when it comes down to it, what tangible things have they done that they have created to make the SBC safer for survivors of abuse and to actually address their many failures and how they've handled things up until this point? And there has to be, lament, repentance, but there's got to be restitution too. And
Hmm.
so many survivors for so long, I've been speaking out since 2018. I know, I was named by Christianity Today as the face of the Church Too movement because it was really my story that kind of became a catalyst for the discussions regarding sexual abuse in the church to come more into the forefront. But there's been people like Krista Brown who have been speaking for years and
Hmm.
years, and begging and fighting. And if you haven't read her book, This Little Light, it's amazing, and I highly
Hmm.
recommend it to understand not only what herself as an abuse survivor had to endure, but her efforts and how at every step she was defeated by the SBC and getting them to do the right thing.
Yeah. I saw you link to that book the other day on Twitter. We'll put a link to that in the show notes for people to check that out as
But
well. Did were there any concrete steps that were taken as a result of the sexual abuse advisory study?
to my knowledge, there has been nothing that has been done
Hmm.
that has provided um, any sort of tangible action steps and relief for survivors or anything.
Yeah, and so one of the clear steps that you talked about is just the creation of a database. And can you go into
Absolutely.
detail what do you mean by that database and why would that be important?
Sure. I certainly think a database would be a bare minimum thing that the SBC can do. And, we're looking at, having a place where any pastor who has been credibly accused or convicted of sexually abusing a congregant would have their name in there. And also, I believe it should include churches who have covered up abuse, who've either hired pastors knowing about their history, or have worked to cover up abuse when it's come to light, such as in my story and Stonebridge.
Mhm.
So I think there needs to be a reference so that um, you know people who do care can have a place to go and truly look up a name or a church and say, how have they handled this? Who have they hired? And see that and protect themselves, because a lot of times there's been so many pastors who have moved on, who've been abusive and either, resigned or gotten fired or whatnot, and they move on to another church without anyone knowing, and
Hmm.
and that church not doing the proper investigation and background checks and whatnot that they need to do. So I feel like, the bare minimum would be for the SBC to create some sort of database that would track, um, predatory pastors and churches that have actively covered up or covered for them.
And what's been the response of the SBC to that? To just the creation of a database?
Absolutely nothing. I know
Hmm.
that that's something, specifically that Krista Brown has been calling for years. Um, when I was a part of the For Such a Time as This rally in 2019, I actually went to Birmingham, to the convention. We were relegated to standing on the sidewalks outside, as they would not give us space inside the convention. But that's one of the things that we called for then, and the response was really disheartening. We had pastors who literally moved to the other side of the street to walk by. Um,
Hmm.
there were people hiding their children from us as if we were, these awful, aggressive, horrible people, and it was really, really, really hard.
Hmm. Well, is there a reason why they would not want to create that database? Have they given any reasoning at all?
To my knowledge, they have not given any reasoning. I think what we're seeing, and with a lot of the stuff that's been uh, come to light, this even just this last week, we're seeing a structure of power, um, and protection, and it has become very hard to ignore that they have consistently made choices to protect their own reputation
Hmm.
over doing the right thing.
Yeah. How, Jules, how significant do you think church autonomy is in this? Just the idea that, there's no, the Southern Baptist Convention, that is not, doesn't act as a group of bishops or presbytery over local congregations, that, really the power and direction of each Southern Baptist church is in the hands of that church.
Right.
How much do you think that comes into play in a lot of this?
I do. I absolutely do. And I will say, for me as a survivor, it's been super frustrating because I feel like at every turn I've been given that excuse. Well, every church is autonomous and
Hmm.
there's nothing we can do. And it's allowed uh, people in the power structure to say, not my problem. And but when you have individual churches such as, Stonebridge, who has blatantly denied a cover up. I reached out to Germantown Baptist Church, who is a Southern Baptist church. They were the ones that ordained Andy Savage, my abuser. In fact, I even went to his ordination ceremony at their church when I was a child. And I came to them after I went public, and I begged and pleaded for them to revoke Andy's ordination. Now, I understand that wouldn't stop him from becoming a pastor or anything else. Um, in, a non-denominational church or whatnot, which he's ended up doing. He's started his own church, but it would be a powerful statement by an SBC church saying, "Hey, we want to do the right thing, and yes, we will revoke his ordination." And after begging and pleading, they came back and they basically told me, "We've gotten your letters and your phone calls, and we have no comment."
Hmm. Wow. Wow. It just seems as if, in the name of church autonomy, a lot of, I mean, even in just local church context, so many
So
times
that, yeah,
things like
that's
this.
been the frustrating thing for survivors is that, we've all been told, hey, go to your pastor, go to the church. And so we do that. And then the pastor and the church, they don't do the right thing. And so at some point there has got to be structure. And I do feel like the SBC does have enough structure to be able to then, if these churches refuse to hold themselves accountable, then to say, we are disfellowshipping them from our organization because that's not what our organization stands for.
Yeah, because there are examples where the SBC
Oh,
has disfellowship churches.
absolutely,
Clearly.
absolutely. They have disfellowship churches over issues regarding their stances on homosexuality.
Yeah.
There have been just a couple of churches that have been disfellowshipped more recently, I believe, over abuse. But, I hate to toot my own horn and say, look at my story, but, my story has been one of the most, prominent talked about SBC abuse stories. And for them to come back to me and, like I said, I've posted that letter from Mike Lawson, the executive chair of the credentials committee, but it's like, oh, we're so sorry for everything you've been through, and you've done all these great things in speaking out, but we've come to the conclusion that Stonebridge is not, that they're not going to be disfellowshipped, that they still are in friendly cooperation with the SBC. And
Hmm.
and so, yeah, there's got to be, I understand, the SBC, and they've worked under the premise of autonomy forever, but there has got to be layers of accountability at some point. And because there has not been, I truly believe that's why we're seeing so much come to light now. So much has been hidden, covered up, and it truly is an epidemic within the
Hmm.
organization.
Yeah. And so, Jules, here we are. We're just a couple of days away from the Southern Baptist Convention in Nashville. What would you like to see come out of Nashville?
Sure. I've really, and I just tweeted this, I believe, yesterday, but I've, to be honest, and I hate to say it, but I've lost all hope in the
Hmm.
FBC doing the right thing at this point. So, that being said, where do we go from here? Well, it's going to look like a completely independent commission. Um, and Krista Brown and I tweeted about this too, but an SBC Truth and Justice Commission, but something that is obviously paid for by the SBC, but operates completely independent from any of the SBC's entities, and that can truly not only take submissions, investigate um, past claims and cover-ups, um, and then but will manage the SBC's response and moving forward, will provide avenues for restitution for any SBC victims who choose to come forward. But yeah, the non-negotiable, really important thing is that the SBC has proven that they can't handle this issue. They can't
Hmm.
tackle this. And so it needs to be completely independent.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. Let's focus on, so turning our attention away from just the Southern Baptist Convention. What about local churches and pastors? Right here, watching, listening, uh, church leaders watch and listen, and people that just part of churches in various ways. What can local churches, pastors, church leaders, what can local churches do for survivors?
Yeah, well, I think what one of the important things, and a great starting place, is to understand that you might not be trauma informed.
Hmm.
and and there's a lot of education that would be beneficial for pastors, church leaders, to start doing, to learn about this, and it starts with listening to survivors, whether that be on this podcast or on Twitter or whatnot. But opening your hearts to survivors, and truly listening to what we're saying. There's great resources and books out there. I just had a tweet thread the other day for saying, for anyone who wants to educate themselves about abuse in the church and how we got here. And I recommended, I believe, at least 10 books. I know Net Grace is an organization run by Boz Tchivichian. Well, I believe he's actually handed over it to somebody else at this point, but Net Grace, they are an amazing organization who is survivor centric. They offer resources for churches, not only to have, excellent prevention measures in place to prevent abuse, but then also to how to move forward, and if an abuse claim has been brought to the church, and they're a great place to start too. I know their website has some excellent articles and resources linked on there. So yeah, I mean, there are steps pastors and church leaders can take, and listening to survivors, and doing what they can to make sure that their church is a safe place um, for abuse victims, and for the vulnerable, so we can even prevent these things from happening.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Jules, it's been great to talk to you today. I do have one more question for you. I know you're busy, and but I would love to hear. You have just walked through so much, and to share your story, the way that you do. I would love to know, how have you managed to hold on to your faith through all of this?
That's a great question, and certainly one that's been asked of me before. um, I have, it's kind of crazy to even just pause for a second and think about all that I've been through, but God has never abandoned me. And
Hmm.
even in darkest times, and there have been a lot,
Hmm.
um, he has been faithful. And I truly believe that he has given me this voice and has called me to use my platform to speak out against these atrocities. One of the things that I say, I know I've said it before in the past, but when clergy sexual abuse happens, it is devastating. It's not only the physical abuse, but it's the emotional abuse, it's the spiritual abuse. Um, when you have the church such as mine that covered it up, um, just the institutional betrayal can almost be more traumatizing than the actual physical act of abuse itself. And it's just heartbreaking. But I do feel God has never abandoned me, and that he has given me this calling to speak out, and that keeps me going. That motivates me. um, I I tell people, my faith is very personal for me now, more so than it ever was. I have a hard time um, making it public, and trusting other people to walk alongside with me or be a part of that. And really, that goes down to um, a total lack of faith and loss of hope for the institution and how they've treated me, and many, many, many other survivors. So I am still a Christian. I'm a believer, and my faith is strong, but it is very personal. And I am I I am encouraged. Like I said, God has not abandoned me through
Mm.
all of this, and I believe He won't abandon anyone who truly seeks Him. And His grace is amazing.
Yeah, that's powerful. That's powerful. Jules, this has been great. Thank you so much for coming on and just sharing your story and being willing to talk. This has been great.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for taking the time to address these hard topics. We need to be talking about this.
Absolutely. Jules is in the show notes. We'll put a link to where people can connect with you on Twitter. And
Excellent.
all right, is that probably best place for people to find
Yeah,
you, hear your thoughts, and that sort of thing? All
yeah,
right,
absolutely. That's definitely where I do, most of my advocacy work. So
all right, all right. So we'll put that in the show notes. Jules, it's been great. Thanks so much for coming on.
thank you so much.